History isn't just written by the winners. It's redacted by the terrified. Take the Book of Enoch. It's 100% legitimate ancient text, yet they kicked it out of the Bible. Why? Because it's not a religious fable. It's a forbidden field report of a genetic intervention. We're talking about watchers coming down, mating with humans, and creating a hybrid species that nearly wiped us out. If this stayed in the canon, the official story of humanity would vanish overnight. You've been lied to about your origins. Let's talk about the book that makes the system tremble. So you have to ask yourself, who actually decided what you're allowed to believe? Because when you look at the history of the Bible, it's not just some magical book that fell from the sky fully formed. It was curated, it was edited. We're talking about the Council of Nicea around 325 AD. You've got Emperor Constantine and a room full of bishops deciding which texts are holy and which ones are trash. It's the ultimate gatekeeping of human history. And for some reason, the Book of Enoch, this massive, incredibly detailed and ancient text, got the boot. It was left on the cutting room floor. And honestly, it's bananas when you think about why. They'll tell you it was excluded because it didn't fit the canon or because it was too out there. But what does that even mean? It's legitimate religious text, man. It's old as Ituran. In fact, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found versions of the book of Isaiah that were verbatim, literally word for word, the same as versions from 1,000 years later. That proves these ancient scribes were capable of preserving a story perfectly for a millennium. They weren't just making stuff up as they went, and right there, alongside those perfectly preserved scrolls, was the Book of Enoch. So if they could keep Isaiah straight, they knew exactly what Enoch was saying. They just didn't want you to know. We always hear that these early church councils were just trying to be accurate, but let's be real. This was a power move. We have to ask, what did they find so terrifying in this book that they had to bury it? When you actually dive into the text, you realize they weren't just excluding a story, they were scrubbing a timeline. If you're trying to build a global power structure based on absolute obedience and the idea of original sin, you can't have people reading about watchers. You can't have them reading about physical beings who came down, messed with our DNA, and taught us things like metallurgy, astronomy, and occult sciences. If the Book of Enoch stays in the Bible, the whole sinner narrative falls apart. Suddenly, we aren't just born bad because a lady ate an apple. We're the product of a massive, high-stakes genetic intervention. God stops being this unreachable, abstract mystery and starts looking like a high-tech engineer with a very complicated project. That's a nightmare for a state religion. It turns theology into biology. It turns miracles into technology. If you can explain God through genetics and advanced science, you lose the ability to control people through fear and mystery. They needed you to think you were small and broken, not that you were a hybrid species with a God-tier lineage. And that's where the telephone game comes in. Think about how long this information has been traveling. We're talking thousands of years of oral history before it even hit the page. Then it goes from ancient Hebrew to Aramaic, to Greek, to Latin, and finally into the King James English we know today. Think about how much gets diluted in that process. Think about what people are willing to do to a constitution today. And we have video, we have the internet, we have records. Now imagine what a few powerful people could do 1,700 years ago when 99% of the population couldn't even read. They took the real knowledge of our origins, the birth of our species, the development of our brains, the actual God energy of the universe, and they wrapped it in parables. They turned reports of advanced beings into stories of angels. They turned asteroid impacts into wrath. They took a technical manual for the human race and turned it into a storybook of guilt. In fact, it's almost comedic. They kept the parts that made us afraid and took out the parts that made us wonder. So what we're left with is a filtered version of reality, a safe version of history. But when you look at the parts they cut out, the nuts parts, the crazy parts, that's where the actual truth is hiding. It's like finding a redacted CIA document where the only words left are "the" and "and." You have to look at the black ink to see what they were really worried about. And what they were worried about was the fact that we aren't alone, we never were, and our family tree has some very, very strange branches. Because if those watchers were real, and those giants were real, then who are we? Are we the heroes of this story, or are we just the latest version of a very old experiment? We spend so much time looking for the monster under the bed, or the giant in the cave. But what if the most terrifying thing in these ancient texts is actually staring back at us in the mirror? We read the book of Enoch, and we see descriptions of the Nephilim, these massive, violent beings that consumed and destroyed everything in front of them. And our first thought is, wow, what a crazy monster. But wait a second. Gee, that sounds exactly like people. Think about it. If you take a primitive primate and you crossbreed it with something advanced, something watch your tear, and you end up with a 7-foot-tall Viking who's chopping off heads, lighting villages on fire, and has this unstoppable desire for conquest. That's not an alien monster. That's a human being. Maybe we aren't the victims of the giants. Maybe we are the giants. We're the hybrids. We're the ones with the weirdly aggressive frontal cortex that doesn't know when to stop. It's bananas when you look at the fossil record. For a long time, we were living right alongside other versions of humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans. And our idea of them is that they were these dumb, club-dragging brutes. But it turns out that's totally wrong. Neanderthals actually had bigger brains than us. They had art, they had tools, they had language. But they were different. Their eye sockets were huge, man, way bigger than ours. Their bones were more dense, their skulls were thicker. Some researchers think they might have had night vision, like a dog or a cat. Imagine being in the woods 50,000 years ago and seeing eyes glowing in the dark. That's a real-life horror movie. So what happened? Why are we the only ones left? Maybe we didn't just outsmart them. Maybe we hunted them. Or maybe we just bred with them until they disappeared. But this is where it gets really nuts. If Nephilim were just a made-up story in the Bible, why do we see the exact same description in cultures that never talk to each other? Look at the Native American legends. The Paiute people have these stories about the Site-Ka. They called them cloud eaters. These weren't just tall people. They were giants with red hair who were incredibly violent and ate human flesh. And here's the kicker. They were said to have 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. Now you might think that's just a weird detail, right? But then you look at the archaeological finds in places like Ohio and Nevada, massive skeletons, some 9 feet tall, with double rows of teeth and, you guessed it, 6 fingers. But it goes even deeper. In ancient Sumer, the cradle of civilization, they didn't use a base 10 math system like we do. They used base 60. Everything was built around the number 6. Their gods, the Anunnaki, were almost always depicted with these strange, non-human features. Is it just a coincidence that we find reports of 6-fingered giants at 2 ends of the earth that supposedly had 0 contact? It's a field report, man. It's not a myth. It's a description of a specific biological trait. What if there was a branch of the human tree or a lab experiment gone wrong that created a version of us that was stronger, faster, and had unimaginable knowledge, but they were too sketchy? Maybe the watchers realized this design was too dangerous. They can see at night, they're 10 feet tall, and they're hunting everything. That's a design flaw. So maybe there was a reset. Maybe we are version 2.00, a little more frail, a little more collective, but with just enough of that alien salt in the stew to make us smart enough to build rockets, but violent enough to use them as missiles. It's hard to say for sure, but the evidence is everywhere if you stop looking at it through the lens of a Sunday school story and start looking at it like a biologist. We're finding new branches of the human tree all the time, like the Denisovans in 2010 or the big head people in China recently. Every time we find a new skull, the date of modern humans gets pushed back another 100,000 years. We aren't the first, and we might not be the last, but we are definitely the result of something bizarre. We are the survivors of a world filled with monsters, and the reason we survived is probably because we were the most dangerous monsters of them all. When we look at the Nephilim, we aren't looking at a legend. We're looking at a memory of what we used to be. or what's still hiding deep inside our DNA, waiting for the right trigger. Have you ever wondered why we have such a massive hole in our memory as a species? It's crazy when you really stop and think about it. We've got these incredible pyramids, these massive stones aligned perfectly to true north, and we have zero records of how they actually got there. It's like we woke up in a room with a Ferrari and we don't even know how to drive. We're a species with a massive case of amnesia, and it's not just a coincidence. Think about the timeline. People like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson, they've been banging this drum for years, and the mainstream is finally starting to catch up. They talk about this cyclical catastrophe. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, something hit us. Hard. We're talking asteroid impacts, massive floods, and a sudden violent shift in the Earth's climate. It wasn't just a bad storm, it was a total wipeout. It was a cosmic reset button. But here's the thing. According to researchers, we aren't just a species with a bad memory. We're a species suffering from cultural amnesia. We went through a massive global trauma that nearly ended us. When a civilization is peak sophisticated and then gets wiped off the map in a matter of days, the survivors don't just pick up where they left off. They fall into a primitive survival state. They aren't worried about maintaining the power grid. They're worried about finding a clean cave and a spear. Let's put this into a modern perspective because it's totally nuts. Imagine if the internet went down tomorrow. If the power grid collapsed globally and 99% of the population died off within a year, what happens to that 1% who's left? They're hunting and gathering. They're surviving. Fast forward 1,000 years. Their grandkids aren't going to know how a smartphone works or how a satellite stays in orbit. They're going to sit around a campfire and tell stories about the great god Steve Jobs, who created magical glass rectangles that could see across the world. They'll tell stories about the cloud, but they'll think it's a literal physical place in the sky where the spirits of the ancestors live. That is exactly how historical psychology works. High-tech knowledge becomes magic. Technical reports from the old world become myth. We didn't just invent these stories of gods flying in chariots or beings coming down from the stars for fun. We were trying to record a technical reality that we no longer had the words to describe. We were a sophisticated society that got hit by a cosmic hammer. And now we're just like kids playing in the ruins of our parents' backyard, trying to guess what the rusted tools were for. It's bananas to think that Egypt might have been the end of something even older, not the beginning. What if the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids were just the last few standing monuments of a society that was infinitely more sophisticated than we ever imagined? They had an understanding of the universe, of math, of geometry that we're only just starting to rediscover. But then the impact happened. The fire fell from the sky, the oceans rose, and the watchers, whoever they were, disappeared. This isn't just about lost books or burnt libraries. It's about a trauma that changed our collective DNA. We are terrified of the sky because we remember deep down in our lizard brains when the sky actually fell. We turn that trauma into God's wrath or divine punishment because it's psychologically easier to handle a pissed-off deity than the random, cold reality of a comet impact. We're like a kid who saw something horrible and blocked it out to stay sane. We're a species in therapy, and these ancient, forbidden texts like the Book of Enoch, they're the repressed memories finally bubbling to the surface. So we have this huge gap in the record. We have the trauma and we have the amnesia. But then you start seeing these weirdly specific stories across every culture. Stories about a guy being told to build a boat to save a backup of the system before the world resets. And when you look at it through the lens of this amnesia, the story of Noah's Ark starts to look way less like a Sunday school fairy tale and way more like a desperate, high-tech attempt to save the blueprints of life itself. It makes you wonder, what else are we starting to remember? Let's be honest about the story of Noah's Ark for a second. If you look at it through the lens of a Sunday school storybook, it's completely nuts. I mean, seriously, think about the logistics from an engineering perspective. You're telling me this one guy rounds up 2 of every living thing on the planet, predators, prey, insects, birds, and shoves them all onto a giant wooden boat? How do you feed them? How do you keep the lions from eating the zebras the second the door closes? And the waste, man. How do you clean up the waste of 10,000 wild animals in a sealed box for months? It's absolute nonsense. It's a logistical nightmare that would fail in 24 hours. If you try to take it literally, it just doesn't hold up. It's bananas. But what if we're reading the manual wrong? What if the Ark wasn't a boat at all? Look at it from a technical standpoint. If you were a highly sophisticated civilization, maybe the one the Book of Enoch calls the Watchers, and you knew a cosmic reset was coming, would you really try to herd 2 lions and 2 elephants onto a wooden raft? No. That's what a primitive hunter-gatherer would imagine. But if you're advanced, you don't save the animal. You save the blueprint. You save the DNA. Think about it. We're doing this right now. We have the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in the Arctic. It's built into a mountain, designed to survive a nuclear war or a comet impact. We aren't keeping actual cornfields and forests in there. We're keeping the genetic data in cold storage. If the world ends tomorrow and a survivor finds that vault 1,000 years later, they aren't going to have the words for cryogenic genetic storage. They're going to say, the ancestors kept the seeds of the world in a sacred mountain to save them from the fire. So maybe Noah wasn't a carpenter. Maybe he was a data curator. If you have a biological hard drive, a small sealed container filled with the genetic sequences of every species, you don't need food, you don't need waste management, and you don't need a massive crew. You just need a way to keep it safe until the water recedes, and you can reboot the ecosystem. When that advanced civilization collapsed, when the gods were wiped out or had to leave, the survivors were left with these technical reports they could no longer understand. They were hunting and gathering in caves, trying to remember a world of high technology. How do you explain a DNA library to a kid who has never seen a wheel? You tell them a story. You say, a great man took all the animals into a safe place to save them from the storm. Over thousands of years, that technical reality gets filtered through the telephone game of oral history. The DNA library becomes a wooden boat. The genetic sequences become 2 of every kind. The high-tech vault becomes a parable. This is what people like Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock are talking about. We're looking at the rusted tools of a sophisticated society and calling them magic. It's crazy how consistent this is. It's not just the Bible. It's the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's the Maya. It's the Sumerians. Every single culture has a flood myth that involves saving a backup of life. Why? Because it probably happened. But it wasn't a miracle. It was a project. It was a high-stakes, last-ditch effort to preserve the biosphere of a dying world. Think about the Watchers in Enoch again. They weren't just hanging out. They were teaching humanity. They were teaching metallurgy, astronomy, and what the text calls occult sciences. In modern terms, that's chemistry, physics, and genetics. They were trying to pass on the blueprints before the lights went out. The Ark wasn't meant to save the past. It was a letter to the future. It was a biological hard drive hidden in a story so simple it could survive a 10,000-year intellectual blackout. We aren't just reading a myth. We're looking at the inventory list of a pre-cataclysmic lab. We are the result of that backup. We are the data that survived. Maybe we're finally getting smart enough to plug that hard drive back in. We're starting to map the genome, we're starting to build our own seed vaults, and we're starting to ask the real questions. The story of Noah isn't about a boat and some animals. It's about a species that refused to go extinct and left us the keys to our own DNA. It's time we stop looking for a wooden ship on a mountain in Turkey and start looking at the code written inside our own cells. That's where the real Ark is hiding. But what if the most insane part of this whole story isn't buried in some clay pot in the desert, but is actually sitting right inside your own head? We've been talking about DNA as an Ark in a hard drive, but you have to wonder, what is the hardware that actually runs that code? Because when you really look at the human brain, it starts to look less like a computer that creates thoughts and more like a high-tech antenna that receives them. Think about the pineal gland. It's this tiny pine cone-shaped thing right in the center of your brain. Ancient cultures called it the third eye. And for a long time, modern science just kind of shrugged it off. But here's the crazy part. It's actually got photoreceptor cells, almost identical to the rods and cones in your actual eyes. It's literally an eye inside your skull, submerged in fluid. Why would you need an eye in total darkness unless it's not looking at this world? This is where the bioradio theory comes in, and it is absolutely bananas. Imagine you have a radio on your desk. You tune it to 101.5 and you hear music. You don't assume the band is living inside the radio, right? You know the music is a frequency in the air, and the radio is just the hardware that catches it. If you smash the radio, the music doesn't die. It's still there. You just lost the ability to hear it. Well, what if the brain is that radio? What if consciousness or God or the watchers are just frequencies that we are tuned into? When people have near-death experiences or when they smoke DMT, they all report the exact same thing. It's not just random hallucinations. They describe entering a DMT world that feels more real than this one. They meet these entities, beings that look like the descriptions of angels or watchers from the Book of Enoch. One guy in a research study said that when he went back under a second time, the entities told him, "Oh, you're back. We've been waiting for you." Things had just continued to pace in that world while he was gone. It wasn't a dream, it was a return. So then you have to ask, where is that world? It might not be up in the sky or out in space. It could be right here, just on a different frequency. Physics tells us that 95% of the universe is dark matter and dark energy. Stuff we can't see, touch, or measure, but we know it's there because of its gravity. We are living in a tiny 5% sliver of reality. What if the watchers never left? What if they just shifted their frequency? Maybe the watchers didn't just give us metallurgy and astronomy. Maybe they left a backdoor in our neural hardware, a specific antenna in our skull that lets us tune back into the source. That would explain why every culture throughout history, from the monks in Tibet to the shamans in the Amazon, all use different methods to reach the exact same spiritual state. They aren't imagining it. They're just turning the knob on the radio. It's crazy to think about, but it makes so much sense. If we are a version 2.0 experiment, as we discussed earlier, maybe they added a touch more alien salt to the stew by giving us this pineal gland. They gave us a way to check in. But then, as we became more material, as we built cities and got distracted by the physical world, we forgot how to use the hardware. We started thinking the music was coming from inside the radio. We became materialists, and we lost the connection. Think about what that means for the God energy of the universe. If the brain is a receiver, then death is just the radio breaking. The signal, the you that is listening, stays in the air. It returns to the frequency of the watchers. This is the rabbit hole that the elites and the church councils were so afraid of. Because if you realize you are a bioradio, you don't need a priest or a middleman to talk to God. You just need to know how to tune the antenna. We are living in a reality that is infinitely more complex than what they taught us in school. We have a code hidden in our skull, and the more we look at the crossover between neuroscience and ancient mysticism, the more it looks like the Book of Enoch was right all along. We aren't just chimps who got smart. We are biological antennas designed to bridge the gap between this world and the world of the watchers. The frequency is already playing. We just have to remember how to listen. It's time we stop looking at these ancient texts as dusty old fairy tales and start seeing them for what they actually are. A fragmented technical manual for a civilization that got its lights turned out. Everything we've talked about today, the redacted books, the genetic hybrids, the bioradio sitting in your skull, it all points to one unavoidable, mind-blowing conclusion. Myths aren't just stories. Myths are science that we forgot how to read. We've been living in a curated dream world for 1,700 years. We've been told a version of history that is safe, clean, and convenient for the people in power. But the cracks are showing, man. The telephone game is finally falling apart because we're starting to find the original messages. We're finding the six-fingered skeletons. We're mapping the alien salt in our DNA. And we're realizing that the Council of Nicea didn't just edit a book. They edited our reality. They tried to turn our awe into guilt and our history into a mystery. But you have to ask yourself, why now? Why are we suddenly remembering all of this? Maybe it's because the bioradio in our heads is starting to pick up the signal again. We are a species with a massive case of amnesia, finally waking up on a park bench with a bloody nose, trying to figure out who we were before the fight started. And the truth is way more bananas than anything they taught us in Sunday school. We aren't just sinners or chimps with smartphones. We are the survivors of a world of giants and watchers. We are the data that was saved on the ark. So, here is my challenge to you. Stop accepting the official story just because it has a stamp of authority on it. Don't just take my word for it, or Graham Hancock's, or anyone else's. Look at the patterns yourself. Look at the fact that every single culture on this planet tells the same story of a fire in the sky and a reset of the world. Look at the way the pyramids align with stars that haven't been in that position for 10,000 years. We've been handed a map with the most important parts blacked out, and it's time we start holding that map up to the light. Think about the people who lived during the Younger Dryas, 12,800 years ago. They probably felt just as invincible as we do. They had their own sophisticated societies, their own insider knowledge, and their own version of the truth. And then, in a cosmic heartbeat, the frequency changed. The sky fell, the water rose, and everything they built became the horseshit of the next generation's mythology. We've had about 12,000 years of relatively stable climate. That is a tiny, tiny window in the history of this planet. And if the researchers like Randall Carlson are right, these cataclysms aren't random accidents. They're a pulse. They are a cyclical reset button that the universe presses every so often to see what survives. We've spent this window building skyscrapers and iPhones, but have we actually learned the lesson? Have we figured out how to be more than just version 2.0 of a failed experiment? The Book of Enoch was hidden for a reason. It was a warning that the watchers are always there, just on a different frequency, waiting for us to tune back in. It was a reminder that we are part of something much bigger, much older, and much weirder than we've been led to believe. We are the bridge between the material and the divine, and we are carrying the blueprints for the next world inside our own cells. So as you go about your day, look at the world a little differently. Look at the stars and remember they are an ancient clock. Look at your own reflection and remember you are a hybrid of the earth in the stars. And most importantly, ask yourself the one question that the system is terrified you'll ask. If the clock is ticking and the cycle is real, what happens when the frequency shifts again? Are we the generation that finally decodes the message and breaks the cycle? Or are we just the latest group of kids playing in the ruins, waiting to become the monsters and gods in the storybooks of whoever survives the next reset? The signal is playing, man. The bio-radio is on. It's time to decide if you're actually listening or if you're just waiting for the lights to go out. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and for the love of God, keep looking at the parts they told you to ignore shit, because that's where the real story begins.